Welcome to the deep dive. This time, we're going deep on something that sparked, I don't even know how many years of debate.
Yes, centuries.
Centuries of debate, exactly. We're talking about the interpretation of verse 4.34 in the Qur'an.
And we're not just going to scratch the surface here. We're diving deep into the linguistics, the history, even a bit of social psychology to understand how these interpretations come about and how they challenge our assumptions.
It's going to be a wild ride.
Uh-huh.
Our guide for this deep dive is the amazing Dr. Abla Hasan and her research. And she doesn't shy away from the tough stuff. Right out of the gate, she tackles that controversy surrounding this verse. You know, the one that's so often misused to justify violence against women.
Yeah, it's a tough one. And Hasan argues that a lot of that controversy, it actually comes from mistranslation and taking the verse totally out of context.
It's like reading one line of like a Shakespeare play and thinking you understand the whole thing.
Exactly. Like you're missing the entire plot.
Yeah, you miss the nuances and everything.
Exactly. So to really get what's going on in this verse, we got to understand the literal, but also the historical situation surrounding it.
It's about the words, but also like what they meant back then in that specific time and place.
Fascinating. So how does Dr. Hasan deal with some of those common misinterpretations? You know the ones I'm talking about, the ones that make you cringe a little bit?
Oh, she tackles them head on. Like there's this idea that if any striking is allowed, it's only as a last resort after everything else has failed.
Right.
But Hasan points out that the language itself, it doesn't really support that idea of like a hierarchy of actions, like try this first, then this. It's just not there in the original Arabic.
Yep.
So no need to pull out the flowcharts then.
Not really. It gets even more complex because she connects this verse to other parts of the Quran that totally forbid using intimacy as a punishment. You know, like that part about comparing your wife to your mother's back.
Yeah, talk about harsh. Who comes up with these?
And that's exactly the point. It creates this contradiction because if 4.34 really does allow for physical discipline, even as like a last resort, why would saying something so incredibly harsh, so deeply offensive, require such serious atonement? It just doesn't make sense.
Okay, I see how that really throws a wrench into that traditional interpretation. So if it's not about a husband's authority in a marriage, then what is nushuz really about?
That is the question. I mean, most translations define nushuz as like marital disobedience, right? But Hasan, she goes deeper. She digs into the etymology, the root of the word.
Okay.
And what she finds is really interesting. The meaning is actually much broader. It's closer to high-handedness or defying any kind of established role.
Wait, hold on. I need to process this for a second. So we're not just talking about a wife disobeying her husband, but potentially anyone breaking any rule. That changes things.
And get this, to back up this whole broader meaning idea, she points to other Quranic verses, right?
Yeah.
Places where nushuz, or its root word, pops up.
Okay.
And she's got examples, like the verse about standing up even when everyone else is sitting. It's about being disruptive. It's about going against the grain.
So it's not just about a wife disobeying. It's about challenging, challenging the status quo. Okay, that's huge. We've gone from what seemed like a pretty straightforward verse about marriage to like questioning the actual definition of a key word.
And we're just getting started. Because if 4.34 isn't mainly about husbands and wives, then who is it talking about?
Okay, you can't just leave me hanging like that. Who is it addressing?
Well, this is where Hasan makes a really bold claim. She argues that verse 4.34 is actually about the entire community's role in punishing women who violate established laws.
Whoa, hold on. That is a completely different way of looking at it. So instead of a husband disciplining his wife, it's more about, what, legal consequences?
In a way, yeah, but we have to be careful about just like projecting our modern ideas about like, legal systems and courts onto a totally different time and culture.
Good point. So how does Dr. Hasan support this interpretation? Because I'm ready to go deeper.
Well, she connects it to how the Quran addresses other legal matters, because it emphasizes interpretation and like community-specific application.
Oh.
So it's not about these rigid universal laws, but more like a framework for justice that adapts to different situations and different cultures.
Interesting. So it's not just about looking at this one verse in isolation. We have to understand it in the context of how the whole Quran approaches justice.
Yeah, exactly. And that's where things get even more fascinating. So we've gone from this single verse, the one that's been, well, misinterpreted and misused for centuries, to this like deep dive that's really making us rethink our assumptions about language, about history, about how justice worked in a totally different time and place.
Right. It's like someone just handed us a whole new pair of glasses, and now we're seeing this verse in a totally different light.
And it gets even more interesting. But before we go too far, there are a couple more things in Dr. Hasan's analysis that we got to unpack. Remember those words, salahat and quanitat, in the verse?
Vaguely. Honestly, I was so blown away by that whole new shoes thing that I kind of missed the rest. Could you refresh my memory?
For sure. They're usually translated as righteous wives and obedient, like further cementing that whole husband-wife thing, right?
Right.
But Hasan says, hold on, those translations are way too narrow. They actually obscure what the verse is really getting at.
Okay, now you have to elaborate, because this is starting to feel like one of those like linguistic detective novels where every word is a clue.
Right. It's like Dr. Hasan is Sherlock Holmes uncovering these subtle clues in the language that everyone else missed. But really, she points out that salahat, it can just mean righteous people in a more general sense.
So not just wives, like anyone who's considered righteous. This is blowing my mind.
And it gets even better. Quanitat, the word that's usually translated as obedient to a husband, actually has a much broader meaning in the Qur'an. Devoutness or obedience to God. No connection to marriage necessary.
Whoa. I'm assuming she's got examples to back this up.
Oh, she does. She even points out this verse where Mary, the mother of Jesus, is described as quanitat, and she was definitely not married at the time.
Okay, I'm seeing a pattern here. It's like all these assumptions about the verse being solely about husbands and wives, they've just been baked into these traditional translations without really looking at the bigger picture, the linguistic context.
Honestly, this is changing how I think about reading religious texts in general. Right. It's a good reminder that translation is never neutral. Like, it's always influenced by the translator's own baggage, their own assumptions.
Which brings us back to the big question. If 4.34 isn't about husbands doling out punishments, then how does the Qur'an approach justice, especially when it comes to women?
All right, get ready for this. Hasan argues that the Qur'an, it doesn't actually aim for this like one-size-fits-all kind of equality. Instead, it recognizes that in any society, you're going to have power imbalances.
Okay, that's interesting. So it's not about treating absolutely everyone exactly the same.
Exactly. Because let's be real, sometimes treating everyone the same doesn't actually lead to fairness, especially when you've got these pre-existing power dynamics in play.
So true. I'm thinking about all those history lessons about like legal systems that claim to be impartial, but they really just reinforced the existing power structures.
Right. And Hasan's saying that's where the Quran's approach to justice gets really interesting. It acknowledges that certain groups, and this includes women, are often more vulnerable, so they need specific protections.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. It's about creating a level playing field.
Right.
Right, like acknowledging those power imbalances to ensure there's actual justice.
Exactly. It's about saying, hey, these vulnerabilities exist, and we need a system that takes that into account instead of just pretending they don't. And this is where Hasan brings in some really fascinating insights from psychology.
Oh, I love it when we can bring in a little psychology. Tell me more.
So she points out that this traditional interpretation of 4.34, the one that's all about husbands and wives, it just doesn't really make sense psychologically, especially given what we know about, male and female sexuality.
Right, like this whole idea that withholding intimacy is a punishment that primarily impacts the woman. It just feels like this very male-centric view of desire and pleasure.
Exactly. And while we're not here to, endorse any particular view on relationships, it's just common sense and a little bit of psychology, and suddenly you see the flaws in that traditional interpretation.
This reminds me of that feeling you get when you're working on a jigsaw puzzle and you've been trying to force a piece in the wrong spot, and then suddenly you find the right spot and everything just clicks. Hasan's analysis is like finding that missing piece.
And speaking of things clicking into place, there's this other fascinating detail in her analysis that we need to unpack, that word mataji. It's often translated as just like bed, but it has a much deeper meaning.
Ooh, I'm sensing another one of those linguistic rabbit holes. I am here for it. What's the deal with mataji then?
This is where Hasan's attention to detail really shines. She points out that mataji, it doesn't just mean bed in our narrow modern sense of the word.
It's more like a specific type of place, right?
Oh, you got it.
Yeah.
She makes a really convincing case that it actually refers to a specific place of confinement, like a designated area for separating someone from the community.
Interesting. So not a literal bed, but more like a space for separating someone who's violated the rules.
Yeah.
It's giving more time out than marital spat.
Exactly. And this tiny little detail, it actually carries a lot of weight when it comes to understanding the verse as a whole.
You know, I'm starting to think those tiny details are actually the most important. This is blowing my mind wide open. So we've uncovered all this like hidden depth in the language of verse 4.34. But where do we even go from here? What does this all mean for us? You know, for how we understand the Qur'an and even for how we approach like justice and equality today.
It's a big question, right? And honestly, I think it's a question each listener kind of has to wrestle with on their own. But what's so brilliant about Dr. Hasan's work is that it gives us this new lens, a new way of even looking at this verse that's been, well, so often cited and so often misunderstood.
Yeah, it's like she flipped the script on centuries of interpretation.
Yeah.
I'm still wrapping my head around the idea that this verse might actually be more about the community's responsibility, about upholding established laws, than about husbands controlling their wives.
It's a lot to process, for sure. And it pushes us to think critically, right? Like, how do interpretations become so ingrained? How do they evolve over time? Hasan's analysis really highlights how much our own biases, our own cultural assumptions can shape how we understand even the most ancient texts.
It's like those optical illusions where you can see two completely different images depending on how you're looking at it. Dr. Hasan just shifted our perspective and bam, we're seeing this whole new layer of meaning in the verse.
Exactly. And this new perspective, it opens up so many possibilities. Like, instead of asking how we can make 4.34 fit with our modern ideas about gender roles and relationships, maybe we should be asking how this verse could challenge those very ideas.
Okay, now you're really making me think. What if, instead of trying to squeeze this ancient text into our modern boxes, we let it push back on us a little, shake things up?
Right. What if Hasan's interpretation, with this focus on community and this more nuanced understanding of justice, what if it could actually give us a fresh perspective on how we deal with harm, how we try to build a more just and equitable society today? I think it's worth thinking about.
It is. It really is. And you know what? I feel like we've only just dipped our toes into this topic. There's so much more to unpack, so much more to learn.
That's the beauty of a good deep dive, isn't it? It's not about finding all the answers. It's about getting comfortable with the complexity, asking the tough questions, and staying open to new ways of seeing things.
And that's exactly what we've done today. We went from a single verse to this exploration of language, history, social dynamics, even our own deeply held beliefs. We challenged centuries of interpretation and opened ourselves up to a whole new way of understanding this really important text.
And hopefully we've sparked that same curiosity in you, dear listener. We want you to keep digging, keep questioning, keep exploring these ideas.
Because that's what the deep dive is all about. Thanks for coming along on this journey with us. And remember, the most exciting discoveries, they're often the ones we least expect. Happy diving.